This format of the episode is slightly different. We're going to be doing 3 of these workshops between now and the end of March. They're going to last for 30 minutes, and they're really going to be about giving you the how-to advice, the frameworks, the practical tips that you can take away and apply to your everyday L&D. So if you are listening to the recording, you can either search for HowNow on YouTube or go to getHowNow.com/blog, and there'll be a summary there with all the visuals that you need to see. And also, feel free as always to leave your questions in the chat, because Nelson has slides, as anyone joining live is going to see. We'll leave Nelson to present the slides and leave your questions in the chat, and then we'll come back to them at the end, unless any of them are super relevant to exactly what Nelson's talking about then, but otherwise we'll try not to interrupt Nelson's flow, and we'll pick it all up at the end. So I think we're good on numbers to kick off, Nelson, so I'm going to mute myself, hand over to you.
Yeah, great. Thanks for everyone joining. Great to virtually connect. An exciting topic that we've heard a lot of our customers and a lot of L&D professionals ask questions about on previous episodes. Really looking forward to sharing what we've learned and also hearing from your experiences and tackling any questions at the end. I thought we can kick off by asking how many of you have ever tracked your steps? Go on, let us know. How many people love a good step count and love to track it on a daily basis? Yeah.
Already getting some me's in the chat, Nelson. I'm measuring mine on the Garmin every day, aiming for the 12,000, seeing what I can get. But
12,000 above the average 10,000. Gary,
you know me,
Nelson.
Nelson.
To the cause.
I'm a high achiever, but yeah, I've got people tracking them on Fitbits, on their phones. People getting 10,000 steps. A few people being honest, saying they're not. So mixed bag.
Well, what you find is when you do start tracking it, and actually there's a lot of data research out there to tell you, the moment you start tracking the number of steps you take in a day, you actually try to increase that number. So you end up taking more steps in general. And so what you can learn from that is the first point we'd like to make is you achieve what you measure. As the step count tells you, the moment you start tracking anything like your steps, your calories, or your sleep, for example, you try to move that number. Now, the risk is, what if you're measuring the wrong thing? Now, for example, imagine marketing teams were optimizing their ad campaigns for click-throughs, but actually no one was buying. Would that be a good idea? No. And in the same way within L&D, do you really care how many courses someone's done or how much time they've spent learning if actually it didn't help them improve their performance and do a better job? And this is what we often see L&D teams falling into the trap of, is measuring the things that are relatively easier to measure, like time spent learning and completion rate. But what that means is you end up valuing the person who did lots of activity, but not necessarily the person who knows the answer and knows how to apply it within the relevant context. And that's the risk when you don't measure the right things. Now, the problem we find across L&D is 36% of L&D teams evaluate their impact, which means majority of L&D teams are looking at essentially vanity metrics that don't actually tell them whether what they're working on is helping them move the needle on business performance or not. Only 18% are actually tracking any kind of movement in knowledge or skills, and just 8% assess the impact of learning on the wider organization. So going back to the point of you achieve what you measure, to start with, we're not even measuring the things we want to achieve. So how do we know if we get there? And more importantly, how do we know what to tweak to move that metric? L&D is probably one of the final functions within a business to have its own kind of data revolution. We've seen this across marketing teams in the last kind of 5 to 10 years, where marketing have really moved from being madmen to kind of targeted advertising. And you've even seen it in customer success and customer service, where we're now able to use data to predict the customers who are going to need the most level of support rather than being reactive. What we're really excited about is that data revolution is on the verge of really hitting HR and L&D. And it's really now the time for L&D to be able to design and build learning experiences that help them drive measurable impact. But the question we often get is, where do you start? What evidence do you collect? What data is actually useful? What we're going to talk about in this session is the 3 types of impact data that you can track to demonstrate the impact of your learning experiences. By the end of the session, hopefully, you'll know what data to collect, how to collect it, and how to use that data to demonstrate and build an impact narrative that shows what your L&D strategy has achieved. Now, the first type of proof we talk about is proof of knowledge. Now, imagine I've just watched a video of how to ride a bike. Proof of knowledge is if I'm able to tell you the exact steps to be able to ride a bike. It demonstrates that the learner, as a result of that learning experience, knows and what knowledge they've acquired. Now, this is probably the most common proof that we see most of L&D teams tracking, and it's typically in the format of tests. So many of you, as a part of your learning experiences, might have multiple choice quizzes, short question answers. And a great thing to point out here, it's a better way to use tests and quizzes to track whether people have engaged with your learning experiences rather than using time spent learning. You could easily have someone who's opened up a course and left their tab open for hours and hours, but actually that doesn't matter if you've got a knowledge check at the end of the learning experience to see how much they've engaged and understood from the material. But quizzes and short answer questions isn't the only way to do that. You can also have discussions. These are structured, pre-planned discussions between experts and learners to assess how much the knowledge they've acquired from the learning experience. You can have a more informal dialogue for a Q&A where an expert can ask questions to the learner. For example, if you've had, you're trying to certify product knowledge within the organization, you can have a very informal Q&A where product experts within the organization are asking the questions, and the learner is coming back with what knowledge they've acquired from that learning experience. Often what's also missed is actually knowledge sharing. Not only is it a great way for the person to reinforce what they've learned, but it's also a great way to understand how much of the learning or knowledge someone's really understood. So this could be as simple as getting your learners to create blogs. It could be getting them to present back in a lunch and learn, so you can really see what they've understood. Simple videos to capture what they've learned is a great way to see how much of that knowledge someone's acquiring. So that's the first type of proof we talk about as proof of knowledge. But the thing to point out here is proof of knowledge doesn't demonstrate impact. It doesn't mean they know what to do, but it doesn't mean they know exactly how to do it. And this is where we go on to the next one, which is proof of skill. Now, this demonstrates what an employee can actually do as a result of the learning experience. So going back to my bicycle example, it's now if I've watched a video of how to ride a bike, and now I can actually get on a bike and ride it. That's the difference between applying that knowledge and it becoming a skill. Now, connecting learning to doing helps you see if there is a material performance improvement in that individual. If there isn't, not to worry. It might just mean it's not the right learning experience. And that's exactly why you want to measure the proof of skill, because if it's not the right learning, then you can go back to the drawing board and test other types of learning experiences. Now, finding ways to demonstrate acquired knowledge is not only motivating for employees, because once they apply it, it creates a feedback loop where they're able to see, I acquired this knowledge and now I've applied it and I can see the real results from it. But it's also a valuable way of reinforcing the importance of learning and development for people managers, because they're able to see the application of the knowledge someone acquired for that learning. So proof of skill is a great way to create a positive feedback loop that encourages both employees and people managers to continue engaging with L&D. So how do you generate a proof of skill? First one is simulation. Now, one simulation that many of you may have tried in your organization is as simple as live role play exercises. For example, at HowNow, our customer success team used HowNow to get people to practice their demos in a safe, psychologically safe space, where they can then get feedback from their colleagues, their managers, and practice what they've learned. And that helps them apply that knowledge and build that skill. You can do this in person with role play exercises. Many organizations actually also do virtual simulations. A great example of this, Audi, for example, have a virtual dealership simulation where you can practice what you've learned in those early days during your onboarding, even before you can start to engage with real customers. So it's a very safe space for you to practice the knowledge you've acquired. Another great way to generate the proof of skill is through stretch assignments. So these are tasks that are assigned to employees beyond their current competency or experience level. A great example of this is at Yelp. They have short-term stretch roles that really put people out of their comfort zone for a limited period of time so they can apply what they've learned and build that skill. Another great example is through projects. You may have famously heard about how Google allocates 20% of their time for you to work on your own projects. And that's a really safe space for you to be able to apply the knowledge you've gained and to develop those skills and practice those skills in a safe environment. That 20% on projects was actually where we now have famous products like Gmail, Google. Even before Google started doing it, 3M used to do the same thing, using projects as an opportunity for people to practice their skills. And actually that resulted in them creating their most famous product till date, the Post-it notes. So internal projects that allow people to practice what they've learned when they normally don't get a chance to practice it on a day-to-day basis, is a great way to generate a proof of skill. Next up is observation. Now, observation is probably the most cost-effective way of generating a proof of skill, because it's not that disruptive, because people are typically in their usual work context when they're doing their job, and you're either formally or informally observing what they're doing. And also, it's a really cost-effective way of evaluating multiple people at the same time. So it's a really cost-effective way of generating, again, a proof of skill, and an easy one to implement. Then 360 feedback. Many of our customers use HowNow to implement their 360 feedback, where essentially an individual will be able to give a rating out of a standardized 5-level proficiency scale to say, I think I'm a 3 out of 5 for leadership. They can invite their colleagues and their managers to also give them a rating out of the same standardized proficiency scale to get an assessment on, essentially, if people have seen me apply that skill, they're the best people to provide that evidence through this 360 feedback mechanism. We've deliberately designed it to be light touch because you want this to be a continuous process rather than a once every year or once every couple of years. You want to constantly get that feedback to understand whether people's knowledge is actually turning into skill. So peer feedback and any type of 360 feedback is a great way of generating proof of skill because it creates that evidence to say people are applying the knowledge that they're acquiring. And the last one, and I think it's a massively underused one, is portfolios. It's quite common within, for example, product designers or brand designers to essentially create a collection of work that demonstrates their newly developed skills. But this doesn't have to just be about design and product designers. You can use it for sales reps, creating a collection of demo recordings. It could be marketing collateral created by your marketing team. There's a whole range of different teams who can benefit from creating a portfolio of work that gives them the opportunity to apply that skill and generate a proof of skill. Now, a few tips on when creating a proof of skill. Proof of skill is only as good as the evaluators. And so they need to also have the proof of skill to make sure they're an expert who can actually verify and evaluate whether you have those skills or not. They don't need to be senior, and that's an important thing. Often we make the mistake that the only person who's an expert is someone who's got a senior job title, but actually that's not the case. You might actually have a digital native, someone who's new to the company, who could actually be a great person to evaluate a more senior person's digital skills, for example. So it doesn't have to be based on organizational hierarchy. It needs to be based on your verified skills. Another tip is it should be positioned as an opportunity to give and receive feedback. Now, you're going to get a lot of pushback and reluctance for people to help you generate that proof of skill if they see it has career implications. Because what that does is it essentially removes the psychological safety, and people are worried that it might have negative repercussions if they can't apply that skill in the right way. What you want to make sure you're doing is these opportunities to practice your skill are actually a safe space for you to learn, practice, get feedback, and develop those skills. So it's really important to separate it away from career implications and really position it as an opportunity to learn and practice. And often I'd recommend when you're working on a simulation or observations is to have multiple perspectives, right? It's not just about one expert evaluating someone's skill, but get other people, get peers, get other senior people within your organization to get involved, because what that does is it ensures reliability in the proof of skill that you're creating, and it also brings some objectivity to the way you assess skills. Now, proof of knowledge and proof of skill tells you that someone's able to acquire this knowledge and apply it. But what it doesn't tell me is, are they able to apply this skill within the relevant organizational context to solve a business challenge? And so this is where we move on to the last proof that we talk about to demonstrate impact, and that is the proof of performance. Now, a proof of performance, like I mentioned, is generated when a skill is applied within an organizational context that actually solves a business challenge, and therefore you see movement or progress in business performance. It's like a lock and key that fits and opens the door to business success. Now, going back to my bicycle example, proof of knowledge was about whether I can watch that video and tell you exactly what steps are required to ride a bike. Proof of skill was about, can I get on a bike and actually ride that bike? Proof of performance is about whether I can ride that bike from point A to point B. And point B here is the desired outcome we're trying to achieve as a business. Now, to be able to do that, first and foremost, L&D teams should know what problem they're trying to solve, and they need to know what it looks like when that problem is solved. For example, if I'm trying to reduce the sales cycle, so how long it takes for a sales rep to be able to win a deal, I need to first know how long it takes right now. You know, does it take 9 months now? And actually the progress we're trying to make is to get to a 6-month sales cycle. And often what we find is L&D professionals are unaware of the metric that they're trying to move. Therefore, they can't actually track and demonstrate whether their L&D strategy has really helped drive business performance or not. Now, with the right data, you'll know whether your L&D strategy has achieved or at least moved closer to achieving that desired outcome. So how do you generate a proof of performance? It first starts with quantitative measurement. So giving you another example, let's say we're trying to reduce the number of bugs that are released as a part of every feature release that the product and engineering team have done. Now, the first step you do is essentially work with your stakeholders and data owners to get that metric. So in this particular example, I might work with the engineering manager or the product lead to understand how many bugs are we releasing with every new feature release. Let's just assume the number is 20. Now that is our baseline metric pre-learning. Then we have a desired outcome. Now the desired outcome could be just reducing that 20, but we set ourselves a goal. We want to move from 20 bugs to less than 10 bugs. And that's the metric we're trying to move. And what we would do is essentially quantitatively track the change in that metric, the delta, over a suitable period of time. Now, I know what you're thinking. Correlation does not equal causation. Anyone who's worked with quantitative data, that's often the challenge. So how do you build that causation? So this is where you can learn from marketing around how marketing teams use A/B testing with different cohorts. So for example, you might have one cohort of engineers who had access to the learning resources and experiences that would have helped them reduce the number of bugs in what they were deploying. And you might have a different cohort of people who didn't have that access. That's a very simple way for you to test, did one cohort, were they influenced? Now that's just the start of how to do it quantitatively. But this is where qualitative measurement can really help us build that narrative. Now, unfortunately, what we've seen is with the rise of big data, the kind of pendulum has swung so far towards quantitative data. Many L&D teams we meet often don't use enough qualitative data, but actually quantitative data is a really powerful way of building a narrative that connects your learning to business performance. Think about quantitative data as almost, it gives you the what, while qualitative data gives you the how. So with quantitative data, you design to collect the evidence that the outcome metric is moving. So the number of bugs, is it changing? You know, is it getting more? Is it getting less? Whereas qualitative data helps you move backwards and assess the contribution your learning experience had on moving that outcome in the first place. So how do you collect this qualitative data? Essentially, you collect it through monitoring and evaluation formats. So things like interviews, surveys, participatory workshops. The information you collect is on twofold. One is to understand the outcomes. So what behaviors have changed? How do we know they've changed? And the second one is contribution. So how, if at all, did the learning experience contribute to the change in this individual and the business performance? It's the combination of the quantitative data that gives us the outcome and the qualitative data that gives us the contribution that helps us build that narrative to demonstrate impact. Not only does it help us tell that story, but actually both quantitative and qualitative types of measurement have their own limitations. And by combining them, and you typically call this triangulating using data, by combining them, what you do is you mitigate the risks and drawbacks of each type of measurement. Now, to give you another example, let's say we're looking at data in our learning platform and our CRM, and we can see there's a strong correlation between the sales reps who engaged with your learning resources and the sales reps who generated the most amount of sales. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the learning resources were the reasons for why there was an increase in sales performance, but then you can interview those reps. You can also interview the sales manager to collect feedback on whether they thought the resources contribute to their performance. Now, not with leading questions, but to understand from them why their behavior changed. We can start to ask comparative questions. We've noticed you started asking questions ABC, or we've noticed you started mentioning points 1, 2, 3. What made you do that? And if they start to reference the learning experiences they've engaged with, that starts to build on your story. You can also even interview the new customers that they signed, and the customer feedback on the experience they had might point towards some of the learning that you covered in the learning experiences. So again, a great example of how you can use quantitative and qualitative data to build and generate that proof of performance. Now, this is how that cycle works. Often we start with quantitative metrics, and the pushback we get from L&D professionals is, like I mentioned, the whole thing around correlation and causation. And that's where the qualitative piece really comes into it, making sure you're combining qualitative and quantitative to build that narrative. I just want to finish off on, we often talk about trying to build a continuous learning culture, but what we overlook is continuous learning culture requires continuous measurement. Monitoring and evaluating impact isn't a one-time event that happens at the end of a training program. Impactful learning experiences are underpinned by evidence from start to finish. Rather than a one and done approach, what we really need to be doing is continuous measurement to ensure we track that we're driving towards that desired outcome. Because if we're not moving towards that desired outcome, we need to very quickly scrap the learning experiences that are sucking up our time and energy. And what we need to be doing is doubling down on the learning experiences that are helping us move in the right direction towards that desired impact. The current economic climate will force organizations to cut back on anything that doesn't drive impact. And that's put a whole new pressure on HR and L&D teams to demonstrate impact. So this is critical that we get confident and comfortable with generating proof of knowledge, proof of skill, and proof of performance to be able to demonstrate and build that impact narrative. Often though, it's not just about building business performance, because business performance, although a very powerful indicator, it is a lagging indicator because it takes time for that learning to translate into business performance. So if that's the only thing you're measuring in terms of proof of performance, you risk essentially making decisions too late. So that's why it is important to generate and track proof of knowledge and proof of skills, because that gives you the more leading indicators on whether what you're doing is actually moving you in the right direction. If it's not generating evidence of knowledge or evidence of skills, then it's highly unlikely that it's going to drive the desired improvement you want to see in business performance. So final tip there is to make sure you generate all 3 types of proof and use them to build the story, and they'll be relevant at different times in your journey. I hope that was useful. Over to you for any questions.
Cool. Thanks, Nelson. We have got one in the chat actually. And just to try and condense it down a little bit for you, Daniel's asking about working with business partners who are typically used to the process of, we need this for learning, can you go and create it? But do you have any tips for how he can work with them to really establish the pain point and the desired outcome and the problem, so that it isn't just a case of, can you go produce this for us? It is that collaborative part.
Absolutely. And this is a very, very common challenge that we see L&D teams facing across customers and many of the teams that we work with. And I think this is where we can learn a lot from products and product management teams, where often, we work with customers who, rather than telling you the problem they have, they might solutionize and tell you, I think this is what will solve my problem. And so what you do at that point is what we would call problem discovery. It's like, great, let's park that solution. So let's take an internal customer, in this case, who's come to you and said, I think we need a training program that does X, right? Or I think we need a leadership course. At that point, what you do is, great, let's park that, but let's go for a problem discovery. This is where you interview and dig down. And there are different formats, everything from 5 whys, to really kind of understand what is the root problem. So why do you think a leadership program is going to solve this problem? What's the problem we're trying to solve, right? Maybe we're not, and we're getting bad feedback on the one-to-ones. Great. Okay, so what kind of feedback are we getting about the one-to-ones? Right. Is it particular teams? Is it particular maps? So really digging in to understand the problem. And then positioning yourself as the expert to say, actually, I don't think a leadership program is going to solve this problem. We could have solved this problem with a great job aid that people can use while they're having that one-to-one conversation. So it is reframing that conversation and to kind of move away from being reactive order takers to more kind of strategic partners. And it comes from, we as L&D professionals need to drive that conversation, right? And I think the more we go, yes, let me go get that course for you, the more that creates a feedback loop where that's all people will start doing. So I think it starts from challenging and telling them, I'm here to solve the problem, not to get more people on a leadership program. I'm here to actually solve the problem. And let's talk about the metrics, going back to the proof of impact. Let's talk about the metrics that we need to measure to know whether we solve this problem or not. And I think reframing that conversation would really support moving away from being a reactive order taker.
Yeah, just elaborating on that, Nelson, thinking of buy-in, is part of it that people think that the process is going to take a lot longer if we spend more time discovering the problem, but actually it's just about where you spend the time. Because if you spend more time just establishing the problem, you probably need less input from other people to go and create the solution, right?
Yeah, exactly right. I think often we make the mistake of rushing to create output because we think output is a tangible way to show that I'm doing great work. But actually, if that output isn't driving the desired outcome, it's the quickest way for you to lose business confidence. And it's also probably the quickest way for you to not get the budget you need in the future. So taking that time up front to kind of really align on the problem, because the problem is the thing that you have in common with the rest of the business, right? You're the expert when it comes to finding what learning or what knowledge is real or skills are required to be able to solve this problem. But it's the problem that connects you to the business. And it's really important to make sure you align and define that problem up front. And you then tie the metrics that would give you a clear idea that the problem exists and a clear idea that actually the work you've been doing has helped solve that problem.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people agreeing with this sentiment in the chat, Nelson, which is great. Just to remind people, if anyone does, I know we're about to run over slightly and a few people are dropping out, but there's still quite a lot of people here. So if anyone did have a final question or two for Nelson, to drop them in the chat now. One thing I noticed when you were talking about a lot of this, Nelson, and it comes back to buy-in, is a lot of these have a byproduct effect for especially employees that are useful. So for example, if you're using a portfolio to demonstrate proof of skill, well, that portfolio is also useful for an employee to justify why they might be able to progress within the company. So is evidence, database evidence that I am now better at closing a sales cycle. I'm able to make a better case for people to get promotions internally, to develop, to get more funding. There's a whole host of these different carryover benefits that are probably useful to get buy-in. So just curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think right now for us to keep our best people in the organization, without a doubt, supporting them in their career growth and development is the number one thing we should be talking about. And Actually, that's probably aligned to a lot of the conversations I'm having with HR and L&D professionals. But one thing we need to be clear about is it's no good to implement a career framework and tell someone, this is where you could get to, without telling them how they could get there. Actually, it's a lot more frustrating if you're telling me these are the 3 jobs I could grow into, but you're not really telling me how I could grow into those roles. And so what we need to appreciate is career growth starts with learning, right? You learn, you acquire the knowledge, you practice, you build the skills. And once you've built the skills, you're ready to now progress to that next step. And so career growth is a big part of employee retention, but that starts with learning. And that's why it's important not just to track proof of performance. It's important to do the whole journey from proof of knowledge, proof of skills to proof of performance.
One final question, Nelson, from Doug in the chat. Or Julia, I could just ask you to mute yourself as well, sorry. Is there a way that you recommend people can do this over a longer term? Because it might take some time for there to be an impact on the business. So I guess that links back to buy-in, but how can people do this, I guess, for the short term, but also the longer term as well?
Yeah, it's to set more bite-sized impact metrics, right? It doesn't have to be the L&D strategy we built essentially added 20% to the top line. That's not where you need to start. It could start as simple as going, right now we're closing, let's say 5 deals a week. Let's see if we can close 8 deals a week by doing this, right? Let's go for a more kind of actionable bite-sized goal rather than a big lofty goal. And so I think often what people find is they set themselves a big impact goal, which takes months or years to be able to actually demonstrate. But going back to getting the buy-in, a great way of doing it is with what we call minimum valuable learning, is really starting with small projects where you can get that impact data quicker to build that momentum, right? Rather than saying, it's much, much harder to get asked for a budget when you're telling them we're only really going to see the return on this budget in 12 months' time. But it's much, much easier to get a budget once you've now built the evidence to say, look, actually, we tried something out for the last 4 weeks and already it's moved the needle in the right direction. So actually, if we had 10x that budget, we would be able to scale what we've shown here. And so often we're asking for budget without enough evidence to show that and kind of de-risk. And I think this is a really big one for us to think about, especially in the current climate, is essentially when you're not getting the budget you've asked for, it's because the business considers it as a risky bet to take right now. So what we need to be doing as L&D professionals is to demonstrate and de-risk and say, actually, it's not as risky as you think it is. And a great way to do that is with smaller wins, right? Is with pilots, with projects that get you early data as quickly as possible to build that case. It's no longer enough just to go with a hypothesis that's loaded with assumptions isn't enough because it seems too risky as a bet from a company budget. So I think it's a great way to generate these proofs, to build that narrative, to ask for that bigger budget.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Nelson. There's a lot of agreement with that in the chat as well. I think we'll go for one final question before we wrap up, Nelson, but around the proof of knowledge, proof of skill, and proof of performance, how should we set benchmarks at the beginning of the journey? Like, I guess with proof of performance, we kind of know because we're talking about the metrics, right? But at the start, especially with proof of knowledge, proof of skill, how do you set a benchmark that's going to be reached? Like, how do you know you've reached proof of skill, proof of knowledge? Because proof of performance is more black or white, but the other two, I guess, not so much.
Yeah, sure. I think it starts with what we want to see is measurable improvement, right? So we can start by setting a lofty goal. So it might be, from a knowledge perspective, it might be that we want everyone to hit over 70% in the knowledge check that we have, right? Maybe in the skills simulation, we want to make sure if we're using 360 feedback, we want to make sure people have moved from a level 3 to a 4. Now, it doesn't mean if they didn't hit that number, it's a complete failure. Because what we're actually trying to track is, are we moving closer towards the desired outcome? And if your L&D strategy has helped influence that movement in the right direction, then it is meaningful. And I think often, again, it's not binary. And it's a common question I get from L&D professionals when we're working with them, whether it's, they didn't hit 70%, does that mean the learning is not working? Not really. If it's actually helped them move from previously, before the knowledge checks, you were getting 50%, actually now it's gone up to 60%. If it's moving in the right direction, there's enough evidence there to build that narrative of progress and measurable improvement. I think one thing to take away is what we're trying to demonstrate is measurable improvement.
Yeah, I think you summed it up perfectly there, Nelson. It is about using those three things together. Alone, they are not as powerful as they are together. And if you use the three, you'll get that indications towards that final goal. Yeah, this has been a great session, Nelson. Thank you very much. So many people in the chat. Testament to how many people stayed beyond the advertised time. So maybe we need to extend these by an extra 10 for the rest of them. But yeah, just to remind you, we've got a couple more of these workshops coming up. You can just go to lu.ma/HowNow if you want to see which are coming up alongside the normal L&D Disrupt episodes. As Nelson mentioned, a lot of our customers are using HowNow to do a lot of these things we just spoke about. So if you want to know more about HowNow, just go to getHowNow.com. And also you can connect with Nelson and myself on LinkedIn if you have any follow-up questions.